Good morning, everyone. Hope you're all having a wonderful day today. Today is the first video of 2021, and I hope that your year is going so far so good. Today we're going to be talking about a very cool product that some people either don't know about, or it's a little bit maligned on the internet, or at least the company is in terms of making holsters, and that is going to be the Blackhawk L2D. Before we get into the videos, if you'd like to support the channel, you can of course like, share, and subscribe, because of course that's all free. You can also purchase AR500 steel plates from me. Those are going to be the first link in the description. We should have new big targets in stock as of this video, and they should be selling out fairly quickly, as all of my plates have been selling out fairly quickly because I have not been able to get enough stock on hand. On top of that, you can also join my Subscribe Star, which is basically a pro to a Patreon, and you get a lot of additional content and some other fun stuff thrown in there. So let's go ahead and talk about this holster. The first thing you'll probably notice is that it is set up on a Safariland UBL. It is actually a 2-inch drop UBL, but the way that the Blackhawk holster mounts up and the way it kind of pushes the holster up on your QLS, it's actually more of a mid-ride than a 2-inch drop, which is fine. I prefer that a little bit more than a straight 2-inch drop. I'm a little bit different body-wise. Not very tall, but I have really long arms. I'm basically an orangutan, but so I do prefer it having a little higher than the 2-inch drop. Now, the second thing you'll notice on here is that the QLS does not fit with the Blackhawk plate system. Blackhawk does have an adapter that's like 15 bucks, but by the time I figured that out, I had already dremeled out a Safariland QLS to fit the Blackhawk mounting system, so now I have this jankily mounted to a Safariland QLS. So, the holster in particular that we are talking about is for the Glock 17. It is a light-bearing model, so this is actually a LAPG weapon light that is compatible with TLR1 holsters, so this is a TLR1 holster. And as the name would indicate, L2D, it is a level 2 duty holster. So you do have active retention as well as passive retention. Now, they also make a optics model and a level 3 model. I have zero experience with those, so I'm not really going to speak to those whatsoever, but it does work really, really well as is. It is also adjustable retention. One important thing to note is that the retention method is on the light. It is not on the gun itself. We are going to be comparing it with a Safariland 6378, and this one is a level 2 as well, but this one here mounts to the, or I should say locks on to the gun, not to the light. So first thing I want to mention about the holster itself is that I did not actually pay for this. So LA Police Gear reached out to me and they were asking basically if I wanted to do some review on some of their products. I said yes, specifically to the light, and I believe I also did a video on their plates, shooting their level 4 body armor plates. But I did a review on the light. It is still in very good working order, and it is a TLR1 clone basically for about half to a third the cost. So I did not pay for this holster. They sent it out for the review with the light because I of course needed a holster for the light, and I wasn't going to go out and spend, you know, $120 to $200 on a holster for that light. So they sent this out to me for free, so I did not pay for this, so keep that in mind. That being said, generally speaking, the price on these holsters is anywhere from $100 to $130, and you can of course get them from LA Police Gear, as that is where I got this one from, which is fairly expensive for a non-retention holster, but as far as active retention goes, $100 to $150 is fairly standard for a really good active retention holster. Safariland, which I already mentioned, of course makes a lot of really good active retention holsters. The problem is they're very difficult to find in stock, and if you try and purchase them secondhand, you're generally spending anywhere from $150 to $250 on eBay if there's one specifically that you want. So in terms of price, although the Blackhawk is a premium holster at a premium cost, it is still a little bit cheaper than the Safariland ALS series, generally speaking, especially some of the other holsters. Some of them are going for hundreds and hundreds of dollars, whereas this is generally in stock and available for around, again, $100, $130. Now, as I've already mentioned, this is of course a level 2 holster, so basically it has passive retention, meaning that the light and gun fits in there fairly snug and it holds it in place. And then there's also the active retention, the second retention system, which is of course the locking mechanism right here that is disengaged with your thumb. Right when you grip the gun, it just falls right into this really big open spot, which they call the master grip principle, I believe is what they say. But we'll get into that in a minute. Basically what it is a lever that when you push it down, it of course removes a piece of plastic blocking you from drawing that light out, because it does lock into the light. The holster design itself is fairly simple. It uses a lot of material, but it's all fairly lightweight polymer, so it does not weigh very much. I want to say the whole thing weighs like 7 or 8 ounces with the QLS system on it. Even though it is slightly larger and bulkier than the Safariland ALS holster that I have, the 6378, they're about the same weight, so the weight difference is negligible, even though this does use more material. On top of that, something that I do want to say is this is open on the bottom, so it does use an open design. So if you have a Glock 17L, I'm pretty sure it would still fit. You might have to do a little bit of work to the front here to get it to fit, but it should still work just fine. Whereas on the Safariland, it is closed on the bottom, so it will not work. Now, open or closed doesn't really matter to me whether or not you actually get any benefit from, you know, rain, because I do get rained on quite a bit, rain or mud, getting to drain out of the holster a little easier. Maybe that's better, maybe it's not that big of a deal. I haven't noticed any issues with it whatsoever, but overall I do like the actual design of the holster. It looks very good. It is, of course, 100% made in the USA, which is really cool. It does have a much larger, much nicer opening than the Safariland ALS system. For instance, this, as you can probably see on there, is very tight, whereas the Blackhawk has a lot more room, probably about 30% more room. So in terms of drawing, they're both very similar. I don't really have a big difference speed-wise, but in terms of reholstering, this one here is a lot easier to get in and out of. So now let's go ahead and talk about my testing with this specific holster. Now, I've had this holster for a while. I really, really like the holster. I've done probably 1,000 rounds, or actually probably closer to 2,000 rounds of shooting with this holster. A lot of that drawing from the holster. On top of that, this is my main holster for dry firing on my belt. So I do a lot of dry fire practice. So in terms of actual draws, we're probably at around 2,000 or so. On top of that, I also took this to a handgun course. It was an all-day course, around 300 to 400 rounds for an all-day course, lots of different drills, that sort of thing, and it worked perfectly fine, no issues whatsoever. So I do have quite a bit of time and experience on this. However, I am, of course, just a dirty civilian, so I don't have any sort of professional experience with it whatsoever. So when it comes to this holster or comparing it to the ALS, I don't have any sort of professional experience. It's all just basically range time, practice, that sort of thing. Now, something that is important to note when you're talking about a holster system is that I was in no way, shape, or form already inundated into the Safariland ALS holsters. I got this holster first, and then I had a Subscribestar member actually send me that holster, which was very, very kind of them. Thank you very much. To kind of compare and contrast, and I may eventually do a full comparison video, but I was not locked into any one holster system or one retention method. So some people have said that this retention method is a little odd to get used to, especially when you're coming from a Safariland ALS system. For me, this is much, much easier and intuitive and faster to get good at than the Safariland ALS. For instance, you have a huge thumb paddle right here, and I hope I have a bunch of good B-roll for you. A huge thumb paddle to do press. It's very easy, has a really nice tactile feeling to it, and it is, of course, knurled to give you some really good grip surface on there to defeat your active retention system. On the ALS, you basically have a tiny little nub that you need to pull down and back towards yourself to defeat the retention method. For me, one, it's much smaller, even though it is still natural and your thumb is still there in the right spot every time. I find that the Blackhawk L2D actually has a much more intuitive and easy retention method than the ALS. Now, some people with their ALS holsters, they buy a aluminum add-on that basically goes through this piece and makes it about 3 to 4 times the size, so it's easier to hit every time. Whereas right out of the box, the Blackhawk is bigger and easier and follows that perfect, basically, grip principle. Let me go ahead and show you, since I have a Glock 17 right here. So it'll be a little awkward of a grab, but basically it is just a perfect grab every time. You don't have any issues. So I find this system more intuitive and faster to get good with, though as I mentioned earlier, there really is not a true speed benefit to either one. Merely the fact that this one here is easier to get good with fast versus the ALS. So just for reference, here is me drawing the Glock 17 with the LAPG weapon light from the Blackhawk L2D. As you can hear it click in and out of place very nicely. So we're just going to do a couple dry fires just to show you that it's fast and intuitive for me, who's not particularly fast or good with handguns, but it is very easy to draw out quickly to get on target. And then of course reholstering it is also very, very easy. So it doesn't really take any thought process to get on target, to grab it and then reholster. Basically super easy because again, it does have a very wide opening on it, as you can see. So reholstering this guy is very, very easy to hit. Now we're just going to compare and contrast to the Safariland 6378, which again sits a little bit lower, as I mentioned earlier, just because of the way the QLS mounts to it, but it's very similar in terms of overall speed, but the reholstering can be a little bit more tricky because it does have a much smaller, much tighter opening. Good and bad. I had a bad grip. Let's just do one more really quickly. So, in terms of raw speed, they're both about the same, but again, I have to work a little bit harder to reholster it without looking and all that sort of fun stuff. So, I do find the Blackhawk a little more intuitive and maybe a tiniest edge in overall speed, though the Safariland ALS is a slimmer, more compact holster, though again, they're about the same weight. Now, in a couple other videos that I've seen, there were some people complaining that you can actually reach the trigger from inside the holster, which is of course a bad thing. The reason you have a holster is to protect the handgun, protect the trigger so it can't get accidentally pulled. And you can, theoretically, pull the trigger from inside the holster, which is of course not a good thing. And they were complaining about that specifically on the Blackhawk. But here is the Safariland ALS, and it is way easier. You can basically see the entire trigger right there, and it is way easier to get it off. Now, the one thing that I would also say that makes this Glock specifically bad for holsters is that I have the Alpha short pull, short reset trigger. So there is no take up. So a normal Glock trigger would be about up to here, about a ½ inch further up, ½ inch, 3/4 of an inch further up, even harder to pull inside of a holster. But this one here does not do that. It basically the trigger never goes forward, so you never have that take up. You just pull until it breaks. And again, short reset on the trigger. But so this trigger is actually somewhat bad and a little bit technically less safe than other Glock triggers or like a stock Glock trigger because it is further back. So like in this holster, as you can see, it is 99% covered up, but I can barely snake in a finger and really painfully pull it back. But if that trigger was again an extra ½ inch to 3/4 of an inch further up, I would not be able to pull that trigger and get it to go off. Basically, my point is that is not an issue with Blackhawk holsters specifically, but that's actually an issue with a lot of different holsters that if you knew what you were doing or somebody else didn't know what they were doing, you could accidentally get it to fire while it is in the holster. Though, again, the Blackhawk actually does a better job than the Safariland 6378. Now let's talk about whether or not you should actually buy this holster, because I think that is an important question for most people, especially if you're watching this video. You're probably interested in how good is the holster and should you spend $100 to $130 on it. Now, I used to only run passive retention holsters like this. This is a Skull Head Arms. This is very fast, it's very secure. I've used this in competition and other various things, and it's really good for what it is. It's non-light bearing, as you can see, but it fits my Glock 17 just fine. But after a certain point, I kind of realized it was pointless carrying or getting used to a big outside the waistband holster that did not have some sort of active retention, because in any situation where you might actually need to be wearing a full rig on yourself and you have an exposed holster, you probably want some sort of retention. So while that is perfectly fine for range, competition, all that other sort of stuff, for me personally, which is why if you see any of my recent videos, I basically only use a active retention holster, basically this holster and also the Safariland 6378, just to kind of mix it up a little bit and so I can do a little bit of comparison between the two. But basically, all I run now are active retention holsters, specifically this holster. So I think that active retention is the way to go unless you're only wanting it for a range setup or a competition setup or something like that. But if you ever have the inkling that you might need to use it as not necessarily a professional setup, but more of a defensive, armed citizen, sheepdog response, all that sort of other things, I would definitely recommend picking up an active retention holster. So when you go to active retention, there are basically two companies right now. There are Safariland, which does most of it because they make really excellent holsters. They do. I'm not complaining about Safariland holsters at all. And you also have this right now, the Blackhawk L2D. And there are probably a couple other different companies that I'm not aware of, but those are probably the big two. Now, Blackhawk has kind of had a bad name with a lot of people because generally speaking, they made really bad like Serpa style holsters that were really outdated a long time ago, and they just continued to make more and more and more. But I think that this L2D is not only a step in the right directions, in a lot of ways, it's a lot better than what the competition is making. Now, if you already own any sort of Safariland holster with active retention that you like and you're comfortable with, I would not recommend buying this holster. Now, that might sound kind of harsh, but basically both holsters do the same thing. They have a little bit of pros, a little bit of cons to each thing, but the point of this holster is it's very, very good. And if you already have one, then you're fairly lucky to have one, and it works exceptionally well. So I would in no way recommend switching from your Safariland ALS to a Blackhawk L2D. However, if you are somebody like me who did not have a holster or an active retention holster that you can use for a wide variety of things, I would absolutely recommend looking at the Blackhawk L2D. And if you have more money to spend, or if you just really want the Safariland ALS in its various models, then you can absolutely go for that. For my money, the Blackhawk L2D does make a little bit more sense in the beginning standpoint because it is a little bit more easy and intuitive to use, in my opinion anyways, and in my personal experience. Again, several thousand draws out of this specific holster, and it's working exceptionally well, no issues with it whatsoever. The only downside is that I mentioned earlier, it doesn't naturally integrate with the QLS system, which is my favorite system to use, whereas the Safariland obviously does because they make the system. They do make an adapter plate for Blackhawk holsters. They're about 15 bucks, so it kind of adds a little bit extra in the cost there. But generally speaking, if you do not have a holster, these are readily available, easy to find, and of course, very competitively priced versus the Safariland ALS holsters. Now, they also make level 3 versions, optic ready versions, all sorts of other versions for different guns. I don't own those guns and I do not have an optics ready gun, so I am not going to talk about how good or bad their level 3 retention is, which is of course an extra hood on top. But for what I have, the Blackhawk L2D is an excellent holster, period. But also, if you're looking to get into the holster game, it is readily available for most models, and you can go ahead to a variety of different websites and pick one up, whereas the Safariland ALS is going to be harder to find, and in some circumstances you're going to have to spend more money. So that's about it for the video, guys. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you all enjoyed. Feel free to comment any questions or concerns you have, or other products or holsters you would like me to check out in the future. And once again, thank you guys for watching. I hope you all enjoyed, and I will see you guys in the next one. Peace off.